I never expected my quiet morning to turn into something I couldn't forget. But when my stepmother walked into the bathroom, everything changed in a way I never saw coming. Moving back home was never part of the plan. After graduating, I had hoped to land a decent job, find a place of my own, and finally step into the life I had spent years working toward. Instead, reality had other ideas. The cost of living was higher than I expected, and job offers weren't coming in as quickly as I had hoped. So, until I could afford my own place, I found myself under my father's roof once again. Things were different this time, though. While I had been away, my father had remarried. Eleanor was nothing like the stepmother I had imagined growing up. She wasn't cold or distant. If anything, she was warm, welcoming, too easy to like. She had an energy that filled a room, the kind of presence that made people feel at ease. First, everything was normal. I kept to myself, tried not to disrupt the household, and focused on securing a job as soon as possible. Eleanor and I got along well, sometimes even better than I did with my own father. There was an ease to our conversations, a natural understanding that didn't need effort. But that morning changed everything. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind where the world still felt half asleep. My father had left early for work, and I was alone in the house with Eleanor. I had a job interview later that day, one I had been preparing for all week. Nerves had settled in my stomach, twisting uncomfortably, so I decided to take a shower, hoping it would clear my head. Steam curled around the bathroom mirror as I went through my routine, rehearsing possible answers to questions in my head. The sound of running water and the familiarity of the morning helped distract me from the anxiety of the upcoming interview. Then came the soft knock on the door. I barely noticed it at first, too lost in my thoughts. But then her voice filtered through the wood, Eleanor's voice. She said she needed something from the bathroom. I didn't think twice about it. It was her house too, after all. Without hesitation, I told her she could come in. The door creaked open slightly, and she slipped inside, wrapped in a loose robe. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her expression calm as she moved toward the cabinet. I should have turned away, should have kept my eyes on the fogged-up mirror, but something about the way she moved caught my attention. The robe wasn't tied as securely as it should have been. The shift was subtle. A loosened belt, a slight parting of fabric, just enough for bare skin to peek through. The curve of a collarbone, the smoothness of a shoulder. I forced my gaze away, but my face burned with the realization. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't acknowledge it. She simply grabbed a bottle from the cabinet, her voice light as she asked about my interview. I responded, forcing myself to focus on the conversation, on anything but the way her robe threatened to slip further. She offered a few words of encouragement, telling me I'd do great, that they'd see how capable I was. Her voice was warm, too warm. Then, as she turned to leave, the belt of her robe came undone. The fabric slid open completely. Time slowed. For a moment, I forgot how to move, how to breathe. Then, just as quickly as it happened, she gasped, snatching the robe closed, her face flooding with color. A rush of apologies filled the air. She stammered, fumbling with the belt, saying she hadn't realized, that it was a mistake, an accident. I turned away, pulse hammering, trying to make it less awkward, less real. I told her it was fine, just an accident, no harm done. Her voice softened, almost pleading. She asked me not to mention it to my father. He wouldn't understand. I nodded. Of course, I wouldn't say anything. The door shut behind her, leaving me alone in the heavy silence. I gripped the edge of the sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror, trying to steady my breath. It was just a mistake, an accident, nothing more. But as I stood there, heart pounding, mind racing, I couldn't shake the image from my head. And for the rest of the day, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't think about anything else. I spent the rest of the day pretending everything was normal. I went to my job interview, shook hands, answered questions, forced a smile where it was needed. But no matter how much I tried to focus, my mind kept drifting back. To the bathroom, to Eleanor, to the way her face had flushed when she realized what had happened. By the time I got home, the house felt different. Eleanor acted as if nothing had happened. She greeted me with the same warm smile, asked me how my interview went, moved around the kitchen with the same effortless grace. But something was off. Maybe it was in the way her hands hesitated for a second too long while pouring coffee. Maybe it was the way her eyes flickered away a little too quickly when we made eye contact. The air between us had changed. I avoided lingering in the same room for too long. Every glance felt like a test, every conversation a carefully measured attempt to maintain normalcy. I told myself it would pass, that soon things would go back to the way they were before. But the next morning I found the note. It was on the kitchen table, simple and to the point. "Jake, we need to talk." That was it.
No explanación.
No details. Just those 4 words. My heart pounded as I stared at the paper, my mind running in circles. Had she told my father? Was she asking me to forget everything? Or was this something else entirely? I crumpled the note in my hand, exhaling slowly. I needed to clear my head. Throwing on a jacket, I stepped outside, letting the cold morning air settle over me. The park down the street was mostly empty, just a few early joggers and dog walkers moving through the misty air. As I walked, I tried to make sense of everything. The way she had looked at me yesterday, the nervous energy in the house, this note. Was it all in my head? I kept telling myself it was nothing, just a mistake, just an accident. But then, why did it feel like something was shifting between us? I stopped at a bench, running a hand through my hair, trying to steady my thoughts. Maybe she just wanted to clear the air. Maybe she wanted to make sure things wouldn't be awkward between us. Or maybe she had felt it too. That idea was dangerous. I shook it off, forcing myself to breathe, to think rationally. This was my father's wife. This was a line I couldn't cross, a situation I had to handle carefully. I wasn't going to let my imagination run wild. I wasn't going to make this into something it wasn't. But deep down I already knew it was too late for that. When I finally made my way back home, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I saw Eleanor through the kitchen window, moving around as she prepared dinner. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The smell of roasted chicken filled the air. The table was set for 2. She turned to me, smiling like she always did, but her eyes told a different story. Something unspoken hung between us, something I wasn't sure either of us was ready to face. Dinner felt like a performance. Every word, every movement carefully calculated to maintain the illusion of normalcy. Eleanor and I sat across from each other, sharing a meal in a house that suddenly felt much smaller than before. She smiled. I smiled back. We talked about safe topics, my interview, the weather, a new coffee shop that had opened downtown. But underneath it all, there was something else. The note, the unspoken words, the way she hadn't looked me in the eye for too long. When the plates were empty and the silence stretched just a little too long, Eleanor exhaled and set down her fork. I knew what was coming before she even spoke. She started carefully, her voice soft, deliberate. She said she had been thinking about what happened, that it had been on her mind all day, that she hadn't meant for it to happen. But then she hesitated. She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time there was no more pretending. She admitted that something had shifted between us, that she had felt it too. I froze. I had convinced myself that this was all in my head, that I had been overthinking everything. But now, hearing her say it out loud, reality hit like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just my imagination. This wasn't just me. She continued, her fingers grazing the edge of the table, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she had always thought of me as family, but recently, things felt different. That she didn't know when it started, or if it was just in her mind, but the moment in the bathroom had forced her to acknowledge something she had been pushing down for a while. I didn't know what to say. A part of me wanted to shut it down, to stop this before it went too far. But another part of me, the part that had been thinking about her all day, that had felt my pulse quicken every time she was near, couldn't ignore the truth. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against mine. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me. For a moment, the air between us held something fragile, something dangerous. Then, as if realizing what she had done, she pulled her hand away, exhaling sharply. She said she didn't know what to do, that this wasn't something either of us had planned. But she also said she couldn't pretend it wasn't there. And neither could I. The weight of it all settled between us. The risk, the consequences, the undeniable pull neither of us wanted to acknowledge but couldn't escape. I told her I needed time to think. She nodded, understanding, but her eyes lingered on mine just a second too long before she stood up and started clearing the dishes. As I sat there, hands clenched into fists, heart pounding, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't just a fleeting thought. This was real. And no matter what we did next, there was no going back. The days that followed felt like a slow-burning fuse. Every interaction with Eleanor carried an unspoken weight. Every glance lasted a second too long. Every accidental touch sent a jolt through my body that I couldn't ignore. We avoided talking about that night, but we both knew it was still there, hanging in the air between us like a secret waiting to be spoken. I tried to stay busy, throwing myself into job applications, late-night runs, anything to keep my mind from circling back to her. But nothing worked. The more I tried to push it down, the stronger it became. And then came the night when everything changed. It was late past midnight. My father was out of town for a business trip, leaving just the two of us in the house. I had been sitting in the living room, pretending to read, but my mind was too restless. The air was thick, suffocating. Then I heard her footsteps. Eleanor stood in the doorway, wrapped in a loose cardigan, her hair down for the night. She hesitated, as if debating whether to step inside. I should have gotten up. I should have walked away. But I didn't. She sat down on the couch across from me, pulling her legs up beneath her. Silence stretched between us. The only sound was the soft hum of the clock on the wall. Then, finally, she spoke. She said she had been thinking about everything, about the moment in the bathroom, about the conversation we had over dinner, about how impossible it was to pretend like nothing had changed. She said she knew it was wrong, that she had spent every waking moment convincing herself to stop, to shut it down. But she also knew one thing for certain. She didn't want to. My pulse pounded in my ears. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw it. The same war I had been fighting was raging inside her. She reached out, hesitating, her fingertips brushing against the back of my hand. The warmth of her skin sent a shiver up my spine. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Instead, I turned my hand over, fingers tangling with hers. And in that moment, it was like everything cracked open. She leaned in first, just slightly, testing the space between us. I mirrored the movement without thinking. Our breaths mixed, our eyes locked, and before I could think about the consequences, our lips met. The world blurred, started slow, hesitant, almost fragile, but then the dam broke. Weeks of tension, of stolen glances and suppressed thoughts, all collided at once. Her hands tangled in my hair, mine gripped the fabric of her cardigan, and suddenly we weren't just crossing the line, we were obliterating it. For the first time since this all started, there was no hesitation, no guilt, no fear, just us. The moment stretched into eternity until a sudden noise outside shattered it. We pulled apart, breathless, both of us jolted back to reality. What had we done? Eleanor's face was flushed, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Regret flickered in her eyes. She muttered something. I couldn't even register what it was. Before she stood up quickly and disappeared down the hall, I sat there, pulse still hammering, staring at the space where she had been. We had crossed the line, and there was no undoing it. Morning came too soon. The weight of what had happened the night before pressed down on me before I even opened my eyes. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel the same. Something had shifted, something irreversible. I sat up, running a hand over my face, trying to clear the fog from my mind. My heart was still racing. My skin still tingled where she had touched me. But reality was setting in, and with it came the crushing weight of what we had done. We had crossed the line, and now we had to live with it. Eleanor was already in the kitchen when I finally forced myself to go downstairs. She looked composed, but there was something off in her posture. The way her hands gripped the edge of the counter just a little too tightly, the way her breath hitched when she saw me enter the room. Neither of us spoke right away. I poured myself a cup of coffee, even though my stomach was in knots, then sat down at the table. I could feel her watching me, waiting, but I didn't know how to start. She sat down across from me, exhaling slowly. Finally, she spoke. She said she had been awake all night, thinking. That as much as she wanted to pretend it didn't happen, we both knew it wasn't something that could be ignored. She said she didn't regret it, but she also knew that what we had done came with consequences we couldn't afford to ignore. My throat was dry. I nodded, but I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. Then she asked the question I had been avoiding since the moment our lips met. What now? The answer should have been obvious. We should have said it was a mistake, promised to never let it happen again, gone back to pretending. But instead I hesitated, and so did she. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine for the briefest second before she pulled back, as if catching herself at the last moment. She said she loved my father, that she never wanted to hurt him, but she also said she had never felt anything like this before, that what was happening between us was real. I could see the pain in her eyes, the war raging inside her. She wanted me, but she was terrified of what that meant. And so was I. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. I told her that I felt the same way, that I didn't know what to do either, that I couldn't just turn it off, pretend it didn't happen. But I also knew we were running out of time. My father would be back soon. The bubble we had been living in was about to burst. We had to make a choice. She nodded, her jaw tightening. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. Maybe we should take some time apart, figure out what this really is before we do something we can't come back from. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I already knew what this was. But deep down I understood. We couldn't keep walking this line forever. So I agreed. For now. But as I watched her walk away, a sinking feeling settled in my chest. Because I knew this wasn't over. No matter how much time we gave ourselves, no matter how much distance we put between us, we would always come back to this. And when we did, there would be no stopping it.